Good morning, everyone. It is great to see everyone this morning. It is wonderful to be here. I very much appreciate the invitation. Again, I'm Alan Tennison. I am coming to you from North Central University, where I have been teaching for the last 10 years. Before that, I was a pastor for about 15 years in Los Angeles. And people ask me, why did I move from Los Angeles to Minneapolis or Minnesota? And my answer is always the same, the winter. I moved here so I could enjoy the winter. My wife and I moved here just a year into our marriage. And so we were just a little bit still newlyweds. And then we had a son who was born here who is very much a Minnesota boy. Loves to take his shirt off in the cold. And so he is from Minnesota. We're not, he is. I love having a 6-year-old. I love just the kind of joy of playing with your son. I love his humor. I love his laughter. And one thing I love about him is how much my son loves stories. My son will stop at the drop of a hat for a story. My wife and I were at family camp this last week, and we had the kids pastor come up to us afterwards and said, we love having your son in service because as soon as we start to tell the story, he's just right there. He's focused. He wants to get it. He wants to hear it. How many know we all love stories? And especially with kids, we love to tell them sometimes the same kinds of stories. So I'm a professor. I'm going to give you a little quiz this morning and see how well you do with this. See if you can repeat these kid stories after me. See if you can fill in the blank. Goldilocks and the Jack and the three little. Okay, you did really well. Let's see if we can make it a little harder. Jonah and the Daniel in the David and, okay, 100%. You guys did really great. You know, what I think it's interesting is a lot of the stories that we tell to our children as fairy tales, the same thing we kind of do with Bible stories, we give them the same kinds of titles. And sometimes we hear Bible stories as children in such a way that those are the stories that stay with us as adults. And how many know that we cut a lot out of the stories we tell kids? Right? I can't give them all the stuff that's going on here with David or with Daniel or with Jonah. But my fear is that sometimes as adults, we never actually learn the real story. We stick with the kids' version, and we don't get the version the Bible's actually trying to tell us. This morning, I'm going to talk to you about the story of David and Goliath. And what I'm going to say this morning is most of our world gets this story wrong. We don't actually read it the way the Bible's trying to tell the story. And so we're going to look at that together. When we come to David, we come to the central character of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. In fact, David is one of the big three in the Old Testament, right? Abraham, Moses, David. One of those characters on which the entire Old Testament kind of turns. 1 Samuel, if you read from chapter 1 up to chapter 16, is a story of great reversals. You have a woman who starts off the story, she is barren, she is fruitless, but God gives her a child, and then God uses his answer to her prayer to be the answer to Israel's prayer, because Israel has a set of bad priests who pervert worship. And God replaces those priests with her son, Samuel. Then Samuel's sons turn out to be no better, and they're judges, and they pervert justice. You know, I think it's interesting. Whenever we have a culture that perverts worship, we always end up perverting justice as well. Those things always go hand in hand. Because if you can't get God right, you're not going to be able to get the image of God right. If you can't get who he is, you're not going to be able to see human beings for who they are. When we pervert worship, we pervert justice. This is what happens in this story. So God replaces the sons of Samuel with a young man named Saul who becomes king, and it turns out Saul's bad at both. He perverts worship, he perverts justice, and it's this moment, if you're reading the story, you're thinking to yourself, well, he's got to replace him with somebody else. And that's what we come to in chapter 16. Samuel the prophet has been called by God to anoint a new king of Israel. He goes to the city of Bethlehem, which at this moment is a very small town in Israel, an insignificant town. If I say Bethlehem, we all start thinking Christmas songs, right? But at this point, you don't know this city. How many know there are cities in Minneapolis or Minnesota that you live in the state and you've never heard of the city? Welcome to Bethlehem. Samuel goes to Bethlehem. Samuel goes and he invites the sons of Jesse and Jesse's family because God has said, there is a king among these sons. He asks every son to pass before him. And I'm going to read very quickly this verse, chapter 16, beginning at verse number 6. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Now, I think this is a powerful verse that is really going to take us into the story of David and Goliath. So I want us to say this together. I want us to say that God does not look at what people look at. Say that with me. God does not look at what people look at. This is the lesson that Samuel is receiving in this chapter. He looks at this strong young man who is tall. He has anointed another king, Saul. Saul's one defining feature was that he was tall. So here's another man. He's tall. Samuel looks at him. Surely this is the Lord's anointed. He looks like a king. How many of you will never buy a movie if the characters in the movie don't look like who they're portraying? Do you remember the character of Don Knotts? Barney Fife from Andy Griffith? How many would never buy him as an ex-Navy SEAL in an action film? I mean, you look at him and you're like, no, that is never going to happen, right? You just won't buy it. Samuel is looking for someone who looks like a king. But what God says to him is this: God doesn't focus on what we focus on. God doesn't focus on what we focus on. So each child passes before Samuel. Each time Samuel hears from the Lord, not this one, not this one, not this one, not this one. Finally, we come through all 7 sons of Jesse. God has told Samuel that it's one of these sons, but he hasn't told him who. How many know that sometimes God tells us how but doesn't tell us who? Sometimes God tells us why but doesn't tell us what. Sometimes God doesn't give us the whole narrative. He just tells us one piece that we need to move forward because God wants us to depend on him from every step of the way. So Samuel finally says to Jesse, well, are these all your sons? And Jesse's like, well, no, there's an 8th one. He's actually back with the sheep, you know. I brought all the other boys. Samuel's like, we're not going to sit down until you bring him. So David comes. He hears the word of the Lord. This is the one, and he anoints him to be king. Now, here's another thing I think is interesting that I want to highlight. Because when David shows up, if you know that God rejects his Eliab because he's tall and handsome, and God says, don't look at what we look at. God, I don't look at what you look at. What do you think the next king's going to look like if God says no to someone who's tall and handsome? I'm automatically thinking short and ugly, right? Yet we're told that when David shows up, he's very handsome himself. Here's the point. Looking for someone who's short and ugly is just as much appearance as looking for someone who's tall and beautiful. We're still getting it wrong. Well, God says not A, well, then it must be B. God's like, just get out of the vocabulary, get out of the alphabet. That's not what I'm doing right now. David shows up. God chooses David. And this is where we come to the story of David and Goliath. The very next chapter, David's already been anointed king. We see that Israel has assembled for battle. The Philistines on one side, the Israelites on the other. And every single day, a large man stands up. Now, we're not told, they tell us how large he is, but I'll be honest with you, there's some disagreement in the Hebrew as to whether he's this height, whether he's this height. I just want you to know he's taller than you. He's a lot bigger than you are. He stands up. We're told that he wears a suit of armor that weighs 125 pounds, actually made of scales. The god of the Philistines is a fish god, so you can imagine these scales. It also kind of reminds you of a serpent. We're told that he has a spear, and this spear has a tip that actually weighs 15 pounds. So now I want you to imagine having a 15-pound weight and being able to throw that like a paper airplane. This is Goliath. Goliath shows up, and every single day he makes a challenge to Israel for 30 days. And he says, listen, we don't have to go to war between our two armies. You just choose a champion to fight me, and if they kill me, the Philistines will serve you. If I kill them, the Israelites will serve us. We don't have to go to war. Let's just have one small fight. And Israel is quaking in their boots. No one responds. No one answers. It has kind of stopped them from going to war because no one wants to be the first guy to stand up and say, I'll fight Goliath. Now remember, what did chapter 16 just tell us? The Lord does not look at what people look at. It's surprising to me, but when we see Goliath, some commentators say that there's more description of Goliath's physical appearance than any other character in all the Bible. More space is given to what he looked like than any other character. So when you're reading this, you have a picture of Goliath in your mind, yet you have just learned that God doesn't focus on what we focus on. Now, David enters the scene. David is a young man who is not old enough to be called up for war. David shows up. He's carrying a bag of cheese. I'm not joking. He's carrying a bag of cheese. You can read it. I have to admit, when I read this description, I can't help but imagine David with the cheese hat on. I'm not saying God is a Packers fan, but David shows up with a bag of cheese. Goliath has a 125-pound spear. David has 10 packs of cheese. So that's kind of what's going on here. He sees and hears Goliath's challenge to Israel. And now this is surprising because up until this point in the story, we have never heard David talk. David has been a silent figure this entire time. He's tending the sheep, so that's where he is. He's called to show up to the party. That's where he goes. He's anointed king. Samuel does all the talking. His father says to him, here, take these cheese to your brothers who are going to war. David does that. He simply does whatever he's told to do, and he never once speaks. Have you ever known a guy who's just like a really quiet guy? And then they open their mouth, and you're kind of shocked at what comes out? That's David. David just does whatever anyone tells him to do. Go here, go there. He does it. Doesn't say a word. We come now to 1 Samuel 17, and the first time David speaks, the first words out of David's mouth are basically this. Who does that guy think he is? Little quiet guy. Turns out he has an opinion. He speaks up. He says, how does this uncircumcised Philistine think that he can defy the armies of the living God? Now, what's so interesting about this is the first time in the entire story anyone's even brought up God. Goliath hasn't brought up God this entire time. He says, this is just between me and you. The Israelites are quaking in the boots. No one is thinking about God. But when David shows up and he sees Goliath on one side, assuming that Israel is just like any other army, just like any other people, David gets offended because he sees this as a challenge to God. Israel isn't like everybody else. We belong to a living God. Who does this guy think he is? If he doesn't see who we are, then he doesn't see who God is. And David has a point of view. David immediately begins to talk about what's going to happen to whoever defeats this guy. His brother gets mad when he hears David talking. And again, you have to remember, his brother has been there for the whole 30 days, and his brother didn't get offended. His brother kept his mouth shut. Now, his brother says, how many of you have ever had a younger brother and you wish they kept their mouth shut? His brother says, who do you think you are, David? Why did you come to this battle? You're not even supposed to be here. King Saul hears what David's saying. And at this point, Saul, who is Israel's giant and hasn't answered the challenge, Saul just wants to get this whole thing over with, and he's finally found a man who's willing to volunteer. So he sends David out to battle. First, tries to give him his armor. Again, Saul is Israel's giant. He's the tallest guy on their side, so clearly the armor is not going to fit David. David even says, I can't even move in this. Just let me go. And when Saul says, how are you going to face him? David says this beautiful, beautiful thing. He says, as a shepherd boy, I have had to face lions and bears. And he doesn't say, and I've defeated every one. What he says is, and God has delivered them into my hands. David's whole focus is on what God can do, what God can do. Where Israel sees a giant, David sees God. And now we come to the passage that we're going to spend all of our time with today. 1 Samuel chapter 17, beginning at verse 45. David shows up to face Goliath. Goliath for 30 days has been looking for Israel's champion, and Israel sends him David. And Goliath is offended. I've been doing this for 30 days, looking for a man who will fight me. And he says, and you send me a boy with sticks. Well, I'm going to tear that boy to pieces. And here's David's response, verse 45. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those who are gathered here will know it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you all into our hands. This is the lesson that David had that Israel could not see. They saw a giant, but David saw God. The battle is the Lord's. 2004, the day after Christmas, our world experiences one of the worst natural disasters in human history. On that day, around 8 o'clock in the morning, local time, there was a massive earthquake in the middle of the Indian Ocean. That earthquake created a tsunami that sent waves after waves to various nations around that region. At that time, there was a family. In fact, I'll just say at the end of this day, 230,000 people were killed. It's one of the worst natural disasters in human history. And to put that in perspective, on average, every single day, about 150,000 people die. On average. About 100,000 of that 150,000 die due to age-related illnesses. So you have about 100,000 a day die due to old age, 50,000 die due to other causes, but on this one day in one event, we lose 230,000 people. In Thailand, there was a family vacationing from England. They had a daughter. They were a mom, a dad, two little girls. Their oldest daughter was a young woman by the name of Tilly Smith. She was 10 years old. And she had gone on vacation with her parents. It was their break from school. It was Christmas break. Right before Christmas break, in geography class, they had actually taught her in England about tsunamis. And they'd actually showed a video, black and white film, of a tsunami that had been recorded in Hawaii. And she saw what the waters looked like before the tsunami hit. So they go out to the beach that morning, and again, this is about 2 hours after the initial earthquake because it takes times for the waters to go. In fact, the last beach hit was 8 hours after the initial earthquake. She looks at the water, she sees that it's frothy. She sees a log spinning in the water. She sees waves coming in but not rolling back out. And she immediately recognizes all the signs of a tsunami. And like a 10-year-old girl, she's very animated in trying to warn her mom and dad. At that moment, her little sister starts to cry because of how excited she's getting. Her parents are getting upset at her because you are just making your sister mad. We're here to enjoy vacation. Tilly, calm down. And finally, the little girl is so upset that the dad says, look, I'm just going to take the youngest daughter back to the hotel. And the mother says, well, I'm going to make Tilly walk the beach with me, and I'm going to have a talk to her about how she's behaving. So the youngest daughter goes with her dad back to the hotel, and the mom is walking the beach with her daughter, trying to have a conversation with her about her behavior. The little girl's still looking at the water. She still sees all the signs. And finally, at some point, she says to her mom with tears in her eyes, Mom, I'm sorry, but I cannot stay with you. And she runs towards the hotel. Now she gets there and sees her dad and her little sister, who's now calmed down, sitting in the foyer. She runs over to them, and the little sister's like, "Where's mom?" She said she's left back at the beach. That upsets the little girl. She starts to cry again because her mom's out there. A tsunami's coming. The dad is trying to calm both of his daughters down. There is a Japanese security guard who is working in the lobby of the hotel. He sees the commotion. He walks over to ask if everything is okay, and the dad's like, "I'm so sorry. My 10-year-old is just convinced a tsunami's coming." Now, this guard is from Japan. He knows about tsunamis. And he says, "Why does she think a tsunami is coming?" And the little girl begins to tell him all the things she's seen. And the guard says, "Oh my goodness, a tsunami is coming." And he gets his staff. They go out to the beach. They clear the beach. And one of the last people to make it into the lobby before the waters arrive is Tilly's mom. This is one of the few beaches in that region where no lives were lost. And Tilly Smith was credited with saving about 100 people. Now, I mentioned that the waters rolled in about 2 hours after the initial earthquake. The last beach hit was 8 hours after the initial earthquake. There were warnings that went out to many governments, warning them that the tsunami could happen and they should clear their local beaches. And a lot of governments chose to ignore those warnings because they didn't want to hurt local tourism. They didn't want to upset people by scaring them. And so editorials after this tragedy were written trying to ask what went wrong. And the name of one of them was this, and it's always stayed with me. Here's the name of the editorial. Why did a 10-year-old girl know what many governments did not? Why did a 10-year-old girl know what many governments did not? I feel this when I read 1 Samuel chapter 17. Because why did a young shepherd know what the nation of Israel forgot? Why did a young shepherd know what the nation of Israel forgot? The lesson that David has at this moment, that his nation, his people, his brothers, his king seems to have forgotten, was that God made a covenant with Israel and will fight for Israel for the sake of his name. The battle depends on God, not on us. David understands this. He knows that this is the God of Israel who delivered Israel from Egypt and slavery. He knows that this is a God who took 300 men with Gideon and they were able to defeat a force that was outnumbering them 400 to 1. Even in their recent history in 1 Samuel, Israel has seen God move in miraculous ways. In David's own lifetime, there have been miracles. So David is the one who gets what no one else does, that the battle is the Lord's. Now, this text is using David's trust in God as a revelation of his character. David here shows that he's better suited to be king than Saul because he trusts God in a way that Saul doesn't. Saul carries a spear, David carries cheese, but David still wins. He trusted God when everyone else let fear get the better of them. In fact, not only that, I love how David asks more than once, "And what will be done again for the man who kills this giant?" He can't believe that no one is taking up this offer. He knows that Goliath is going to lose. He can't believe no one is hearing the challenge. David's saying, so what? They're going to get to marry the king's daughter? They're not going to have to pay taxes anymore? They're going to become a hero in Israel? It's like David sees a winning lottery ticket on the floor, and he's asking everyone who the ticket belongs to, and people keep ignoring it. Finally, David says, well, then I'll do it. No one else is going to. I'll take the ticket. He trusted God because he remembered God and knew that God in his faithfulness would remember his people. I cannot say for sure why Israel forgot in this moment that the battle is the Lord's. But sometimes I wonder if it's the same reason that we forget that the battle is the Lord's. I think sometimes as Christians, we lose our sense of dependence upon God because we're starting to live our life as if we trust primarily on our own resources. I mean, how many of you have ever prayed that you could find a winning lottery ticket? So that not play the lottery, because of course that would be wrong, but if I found one, right? If I could just find a winning lottery ticket. Because why? Because then I would never have to worry about money again. And sometimes what we mean by that is this: I would never have to depend on God for my financial care again. I want to depend on my resources. And when those resources are depleted, we no longer have the experience of depending on God. If I have $1 million in the bank and I lose $1 million in the bank, how I respond to that is going to be entirely based as to whether I've depended on that rather than God. Sometimes I think as Christians we struggle because we simply can't see how God will win the victory because we can't imagine it. Have you ever been in a need? You didn't have the resources for it. You knew God could do it, but because you couldn't figure out how God could do it, you thought God couldn't do it. Here's my thing. God isn't limited by our lack of imagination. God isn't limited by our lack of imagination. The Lord does not focus on what we focus on. Sometimes we limit God's actions to the very narrow ways by which we count victory. Sometimes I think as Christians, we struggle because things don't happen the way that we planned for them to happen, and we were trusting in our own planning. Because can it really be God's win if it's not my win? I laid it out. I thought it could happen in such and such a way. It didn't happen that way. And even if God is still at work, it's not the way I wanted it to be. Can it be God's win if it's not my win? We're trusting in our resources more than God. We're trusting in our imagination more than God. We're trusting in our planning more than God. And it's easy to forget when we see a giant that's bigger than our resources, bigger than our imagination, bigger than our planning, that the battle is the Lord's. We have to remember that God is the one who's really the giant. This is where we get the story of David and Goliath wrong the entire time. We always think of David and Goliath as a story of a combative mismatch between David and Goliath, and in this story, the underdog wins. So we'll tell the story and we'll use it as analogies. So if Baylor University looks like they could win the NCAA, we're all like, it's a David and Goliath story. If some politician comes out of the nowhere to win the presidency, it's a David and Goliath story. Here's what the story's actually telling us. In the story, Goliath is the one who's the underdog. In the story, the underdog loses. It's just that David was the only one who could see it. It wasn't David versus Goliath. It was Goliath versus God, and there's no way Goliath was ever going to win. David saw that the battle is the Lord's. He got the point. And we have to remember that when we know it's God's battle, that actually frees us to act. Because now I can trust in God's ability more than my own. It's those who don't believe the battle is the Lord's who are crippled by inaction. It frees us from fear that we might not be enough. I want to let you know this right up front. You are not enough. Say that to your neighbor. You are not enough. I want you to be encouraged this morning. You're not enough. That's okay because you don't have to be enough. God is enough. It's God's battle to win. It's God's battle to lose. All we have to do is trust in God. I told you the story about Tilly Smith, this young girl from England. There is another story of a young 10-year-old named Abby Wurtzler from New Zealand who in 2009, the same thing happened again. She was vacationing with her family in the Samoa. She was on the beach when she, who was there for Christmas vacation, who had just learned about tsunamis in school, saw the signs of tsunami on the water, and she warned her family, who this time listened because it was just 5 years earlier the Indian Ocean tsunami had happened. They began clearing their stuff. They went up and down the beach telling other people what was going on. People began clearing their stuff, and before the waters came in, dozens and dozens of people had cleared the beach. And she's credited with saving dozens and dozens of lives. Now, as with most stories, there may be more than one lesson that we can glean from these tales about these two girls. Now, practically, we could say the lesson is this. If you're ever on a beach and a 10-year-old girl comes up to you and just tells you to run, just start running. Don't question it. Don't ask why. Grab your stuff, grab your loved ones, go to higher ground. But another similarity is that both girls credited their teachers with their saving knowledge. Each one said they had recently learned about tsunamis in school, And it was their teacher that taught them to recognize the sign. In fact, the newspapers interviewed Abby's teacher, Kay Madge. And Kay Madge was quoted in the newspapers as saying this. This is an exact quote. "It's the first time in 20 odd years of teaching that I can be absolutely sure that something I taught sunk in and stayed in, and it was me that taught it." It's the first time in 20 years I can be sure that what was me who taught, what sunk in and stayed in. As a teacher and a former pastor, I understand the words of Kay Madge, because sometimes in my own life, I've wondered what difference I'm making in the end. At least with my students now, tests are over, it's summer vacation, but I've wondered, did they learn what I tried to teach them, or did they just spend that semester abusing their short-term memory? Have I made a difference? With members of my congregation as a pastor, I was constantly frustrated that some seemed to grow so little, and sometimes members of my church would grow backwards in their life choices. It's a lot easier for a pastor, and I'll just let you know this is a secret. It's a lot easier for a pastor to measure the growth of new believers than to measure the growth of established believers. Because sometimes established believers seem to stop. And I've wondered as a pastor, am I making a difference? I want you to know the battle is the Lord's. It's not my job to do everything I can do as if it's all up to me. It's my job to do everything I can do as if it's all up to God. And I can trust in that. I'm going to give you one more story here, and we're going to close in a word of prayer. And I will let you know this is a difficult story. When I was 15 years old, my youth group was involved in the worst drunk driving accident in our nation's history to this day. We were a youth group of about 80 kids. We had gone for a day to an amusement park. And our church had an ordinary school bus that we had bought that was our church bus, big yellow school bus. We had filled the bus with kids. On a school bus, there are 22 seats, and kids can set 3 to a seat, plus the driver. We had 67 on the bus. While we were enjoying the day at an amusement park, there was a man by the name of Larry who was a factory worker who had gotten off work for the weekend and went out with some friends to celebrate. He went to a bar for some drinks. Then they decided to bar hop to another bar for some more drinks. And finally, they ended up at someone's house to do vodka shots. Now, Larry had recently lost a lot of weight. Like within 100 years, he'd lost almost 100 pounds. And so Larry was taking in the same amount of alcohol he normally did, but he was 100 pounds lighter. He was drunk by the end of the night. His friends actually tried to take his truck keys away from him, but Larry basically said to them, "Look, I live a mile from here. I know I can make it home." They gave him his truck keys. He got on the interstate because his house was the next exit over, but rather than getting on the right side of the interstate, he got on the wrong side of the interstate, not realizing he was driving in the wrong direction, and that's when he met our church bus. Now, we're in Kentucky. We're in a very place that's hilly, has mountains, regions like this. We're driving around a large hill when we met him. And according to the state police, our bus driver, who was our associate pastor, probably had about 2 to 4 seconds to react from the time he saw the lights to the time of impact. We hit him right headlight to right headlight. Our youth pastor was standing on the steps of the bus. That's where the collision occurred, crushed him inside. It drove the axle 18 inches under the bus, punctured the gas tank, the engine explodes, and now fire sweeps under the bus and starts coming up through the sections of the bus, catching the seats on fire. I'm sitting in the back, almost third to the back door. I'm asleep. Most of us in this bus are asleep. It's the end of the day, long day at amusement park. I hear a scream behind me. The jolt wakes me up at the crash. I hear someone scream, and I immediately stand to look what's behind me, and I'm facing an open emergency door because someone else has already jumped out, and now the kids behind me rush out, knock me off the bus. I'm still trying to wake up. I don't know what's going on. I just see all of these feet run past me, and how many of you know if you ever see feet run past you, just run? I take off after them. Finally, I recognized some shoes. I had a friend who wore 16 size shoe. I saw the shoe. I knew my friend. I looked up. I'm like, what's happening? And he's just looking past me back at the bus. I turn around and I see a bus fully in flames and kids are still coming out the back. People stop on the interstate. There's a registered nurse who is driving by who just happened to have a bunch of blankets in the back of her car. They're throwing blankets over kids, laying them out in the median. Eventually, ambulances come from 5 different hospitals. There are truckers who all basically arrange their lights to create a helipad for helicopters so they can land on the interstate and airlift kids to and from. Now, I am a pastor's kid. My dad and mom were the senior pastors. Every adult who was with us was killed except one, but she had collapsed outside the bus, and we didn't actually know her because she was just visiting her friend for that day. So I'm 15, and I'm one of the oldest people there. I do what a pastor's kid does, right? I run up to the state trooper who's first to arrive on the scene, and I'm trying to tell him where we are, where we're from. This is 88. There's no cell phones. I need to get word to my dad of what's going on because I know that he's back at the church waiting for us to arrive, and parents are coming to pick up their kids. Now, the state trooper, I don't even know if he listens to me because everything's so busy and so crazy. A man, one of the kids who was first off the bus, sitting in the very back, he calls his dad to tell him what happened when he gets to the hospital. He's the first one to be taken to a hospital. His dad calls my dad at the church and just says, Pastor, our bus has been involved in a horrible collision. They're taking our kids to 10 different hospitals. My son's at one of them. I'm going to pick him up right now. Bye. Click. That's all my dad has to go on. He immediately calls my mom in. He calls the board members in. I need everyone at the church right now. The parents are waiting for their kids. It's the time we're supposed to be there. He calls around hospitals, police, whoever he can reach. Finally, he reaches the state police. And I think this is a grace of God because the state trooper he talks to happens to be the one that I talk to. And the state trooper says to him, Pastor, before I tell you anything else, I need you to hear this. Your son was standing next to me tonight, and your son is okay. How many know that you may be a pastor, but you're a parent first? And at that moment, my parents were set free to minister to the rest of the church. I'm taken, they take me to a hospital. I was injured just very slightly the way I fell off the bus when I was pushed off. I twisted my leg. But they eventually, the man who comes to pick up his son, who called my dad, takes a bunch of us in his van because the hospital is willing to release us. I get back to the church, and that's when I realized for the first time how bad it was. Because there are news vans all over our parking lot. And now it's Sunday morning. So people are arriving for worship. Parents have been there since that night waiting for their kids to return. Because they rushed our kids to so many different hospitals, they didn't have time to write down everyone's name, and there are 33 unaccounted for, and they now know there are 16 bodies on the bus. But as they started separating those bodies because they had fused together in the heat, the number jumps up from 16 to 22, then later 24, and finally the number stops at 27. 27 people killed, 3 adults and 24 children. In a 48-hour period, my dad has to preach the funeral of 16 people, most of them kids. My parents had to walk with families through those funerals, through the days, months, weeks, years to come. In fact, my mom, who is still living, continues to call families every birthday and every anniversary of the wreck. They had to walk through families who now their children who had lived but were burned severely, 13 were burned severely, and now had to have multiple skin graft operations that would now govern their lives for the next year or two. They walked with them through that. The drunk driver actually survived, and they had to walk with the church through the trial of this drunk driver who had killed and destroyed, almost destroyed so many families. Now, I could tell you story after story of how God was with families in that tragedy, but I'm going to focus on just one. It was a man by the name of Lee Williams. Lee Williams, his wife, and both of his daughters were on the bus. None of them survived. He was the first sergeant at Fort Knox, Kentucky, oversaw the hospital. He was a medic. So when they asked him for dental records, he understood what they were saying. Now, he told my parents after the news had come, he said that my mom and dad are dead. I'm an only child. My mom and dad were only children. He said, I have no brothers or sisters, no aunts or uncles, no cousins, no parents. I've lost my wife and both of my kids. He said, you know what it's like to live in a world where there is no one who is related to you. So there's no one living right now who's related to me. He was having a hard time. My parents, of course, were meeting with all the families as pastors. And once they invited Lee to our house for lunch just to check up on him. He came during his break from the hospital. And as he showed up, his chin was resting on his chest. This was a few months after the crash. Lee, I'll just tell you a little bit about how he had handled this initially. He would go to work at the end of an old day at the hospital at Fort Knox. Then he would drive to a donut shop about 90 minutes away. He would have a donut and a cup of coffee. Then he would drive back to his house, pull into the driveway, pull his seat back, and go to sleep. Then in the morning, he would wake up, he would go inside the house, get showered, get dressed, and then go back to work. Lee comes in, and my mom says to him, Lee, what happened? What happened? He says to her, well, I lost the last link to my family today. He said, when our girls were little, we bought them a dog. That was just the heart of their lives. He said, but that dog has been grieving herself over the loss of that girls. The dog won't eat, won't sleep. She spends all day going from room to room to room looking for the girls. So the only way I can even get her down for a nap is to put their clothes on the floor next to her. This morning, the vet convinced me that the humane thing to do was to put her down. So I lost the last link to my family today. As he left after lunch, walked back to his car, again, chin resting on his chest, my mom said that she said in her heart, Lord, if someone doesn't get a hold of you for him, he's not going to make it. And she felt the Holy Spirit say to her, you're someone. You're someone. So my mom cleared her schedule, and she spent the next 3 hours in prayer, praying for Lee Williams. In Pentecostalism, we have this phrase that we would sometimes call, you might have heard it, praying through. Praying is when you reach heaven. But praying through is when you don't stop until you know heaven reaches you. My mom prayed for 3 hours until she felt the Lord say to her, I will restore his joy once again. She called him up. She said, Lee, I have a word from the Lord for you. He goes, what is it? The Lord has told me that he's going to restore your joy once again. He said to her, that's all I have to live for right now. A few months later, he calls my mom up. The associate pastor who had been driving the bus, who was also killed. Lee's wife was the choir director for the youth group and had come with the youth. The youth pastor was killed. His wife was killed. The associate pastor was killed. His wife was a young woman in her 30s, close in age to Lee. She had had a daughter who was burned severely on the bus but survived, and then she had 2 smaller children who had not gone. And Lee said to my mom, I want to call Dottie, the associate pastor's widow, out for lunch. I want to ask her out. He said, there's no one at the church who really knows. You know, a lot of people have lost kids like I have, but no one really has lost a spouse. Our youth pastor's wife didn't attend church. He said, no one else here has really lost a spouse. I really want to meet with someone and just talk to them. And my mom said in her wisdom, Lee, it's too soon. Dottie, has lost her husband less than a year ago. You need to be patient. He goes, okay. He calls my mom the next month and says, I'd like to ask Dottie out. My mom says, Lee, it's too soon. He says, okay. He calls her the next month, says, I'd like to ask Dottie out. My mom says, Lee, it's too soon. He says, okay. Finally, he calls her up and says, the next month, I'm asking Dottie out tomorrow. And my mom says, Lee, I'm having lunch with Dottie today. I will play CIA for you. But my mom's joke was this: Lee didn't know she was a double agent. She goes over to Dottie's house. They're getting ready to go for lunch. And she just kind of casually says, Dottie, do you ever want to get remarried? And Dottie says to her, well, she said, I'm in my 30s. She said, I don't want to live the rest of my life alone, but who's going to take on a widow with 3 kids, one of whom is still suffering with injuries? My mom said, well, let me think about it. And she said, what would you say if Lee Williams asked you out? Dottie said, I would say he should have done it yesterday. Now, my mom had an answer, but she still wasn't at peace. And on the way to the restaurant where she and Dottie were going to have lunch, she prayed quietly. Dottie didn't know this, but she said, Lord, this church has already experienced too much heartbreak. They can't experience anymore. If this is of you, let Lee Williams be at the restaurant when we get there. Now, he works at Fort Knox, Kentucky. He's a soldier. There's no reason for him to be a restaurant in Radcliffe, Kentucky in lunch. And as they pull into the parking lot, guess who's there pulling out? It's Lee Williams. My mom, he stops, he sees them, says, hey, how are you ladies doing? She goes, Lee, what are you doing here? My mom said, I knew what he was doing there. I didn't know if he did. And Lee said, our colonel had a going away party today. We had rented out a restaurant and they lost our reservation. And at the last minute, we were forced to come here. My mom felt like she had a word from the Lord. That night, Lee calls her, says, I saw you were with Dottie today. Said, what did she say? My mom said, she said, you should have asked her yesterday. He said, I would have if you would have let me. He asked her out for lunch. That next day, they had lunch for 4 hours just talking. Dottie calls my mom at the end of the lunch to say, I think I'm in love. That next year, Lee and Dottie decide to get married. And when they get married, it's not just two people getting married, because she has 3 kids. All 3 of them are in the wedding, and when they light the unity candle, there are 5 candles lighting one unity candle. This wedding wasn't just an event for our church, because this wrecked our whole community, and the whole community showed up as these 2 families were coming together. That first Christmas, they have opened their presents that Lee is celebrating with his family, with Dottie and her kids. And the oldest daughter, Christy, one who had been severely burnt, says to Lee after they've opened their gifts, Lee, I've talked this over with my brother and my sister, and we know that we will never, ever replace your girls in your heart, but we're asking for you to make room for us. And you know that you will never replace our dad in our heart, but we want you to know that we have made room for you. And this morning, Lee, Christmas morning, we would like to start calling you Dad. Christy wrapped her arms around him and said, Merry Christmas, Dad. Robbie wrapped his arms around him and said, Merry Christmas, Dad. Tiffany, the 5-year-old, wrapped her arms around him and said, Merry Christmas, Daddy. And Lee said, for the next 30 minutes, I cried uncontrollably because the words I thought I would never hear again, I heard that day. He called my mom and said, today is the day that God has restored my joy. Last week, Lee and Dottie celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary. They have 9 grandkids. They have been in ministry now. He retired from the military for 30 years. And I'm going to tell you that in a situation that seems impossible to us, it's still not impossible to God. The battle is the Lord's. I want to close in a word of prayer. And I simply want to ask that whatever it is that you may be dealing with this morning, is this something that you can turn over to God as if it's His battle and not your battle? There are some in here who may be depending on your resources, and your resources aren't enough. You may be depending on your imagination, and you can't figure a way around it. You may be depending on your planning, and it's not happening the way that you want it to happen. I'm here to tell you this morning, the battle is still the Lord's. And God has promised that for the sake of His name, He's going to fight for His people. There may be some in here, and I don't know you because I don't know the members of this church. You're not even a believer. You're not someone who's ever given your life, your heart to Jesus. I'm here to tell you that if you will surrender your life to God, your battle will become God's battle because He's going to make you a part of His people and His mission. So as we close in a word of prayer, I'm going to ask for every head bowed. And I just want to ask if there's someone in here that you do not know Jesus as Lord. You've never asked Him to be your God. You've never committed your life to Him. I'm going to pray for you this morning, and I just want you to repeat this prayer after me and to say, God, I know that I need you, and I'm asking you to forgive me of my sins. I believe that through Jesus, you can be my God, and I can be your child. And I pray this morning in Jesus' name. Whatever needs you may have here as a church, whatever needs God has brought to your mind, God is in charge, God is in control, and God is on your side. I'm praying that you would bring that to the Lord right now. Lift that up to God and say, Lord, I can only do what I can do, but I know that you can do so much more. I give this need to you, trusting and knowing, Lord, that it is your battle and I am your child. God, I thank you for this church. I thank you for the faithfulness of the people of this church, God, who are here waiting an answer for the leadership of their community. And Lord, I know that this is your people, this is your church, this is your battle. And I commit Summit Church unto you, and I thank you for the things that you will do for these people, the answers that you are already providing. And God, I thank you that the battle belongs to the Lord. We commit this unto you. We commit ourselves unto you for your glory, because whatever is for your glory, we know is for our good. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.